The year is 1888, and the location is the East End of London. A thick yellow fog chokes the cobblestone streets of Whitechapel, where gas lamps flicker weakly against the encroaching darkness. This is a place of destitution and despair, where the working class struggle to survive in overcrowded tenements and lodging houses. But amidst the poverty and the grime, a new terror is about to emerge from the shadows. It is a terror that will grip the entire city of London and eventually the world. A nameless predator begins to stalk the vulnerable women of the district, leaving behind a trail of gruesome violence that defies comprehension. This is the story of the Autumn of Terror and the unknown killer who would come to be known as Jack the Ripper. Whitechapel in the late 19th century was a labyrinth of narrow alleyways and dark courtyards. It was an area largely ignored by the wealthy residents of the West End, unless they were reading about its squalor in the morning newspapers. The population was dense and transient, with thousands of people crammed into unsanitary living spaces. Crime was rampant, and alcoholism was a common escape from the harsh realities of daily life. For many women in this district, selling their bodies was the only way to pay for a bed for the night or a glass of gin to numb the cold. These women were the most vulnerable members of society, and they became the primary targets for a killer who hunted with surgical precision and ruthless efficiency. The nightmare began in the early hours of August 31st. Mary Ann Nichols, who was known to her friends as Polly, was 43 years old and struggling to make ends meet. She had been turned away from a lodging house earlier that night because she lacked the 4 pence required for a bed. Polly was last seen alive walking down Whitechapel Road, confident she would soon earn her lodging money. At approximately 3:40 in the morning, a carman named Charles Cross found her body lying in front of a gated stable entrance on Bucks Row. Her throat had been severed deeply and her abdomen mutilated. The brutality of the attack shocked the responding officers and signaled that a new breed of killer was at work. The discovery of Mary Ann Nichols sent a ripple of unease through the community, but many dismissed it as a singular act of gang violence. The police were baffled by the lack of motive and the sheer savagery of the wounds. Bucks Row was a quiet street, and yet no one had heard a scream or a struggle. The killer had vanished into the labyrinth of the East End without leaving a trace. Inspector Abberline of Scotland Yard was assigned to the case. He was a man who knew the area well, having worked his way up through the ranks of the police force. Abberline began to interview locals and track the movements of Polly Nichols, but the clues were sparse and the witnesses unreliable. Just over a week later, on the morning of September 8th, the killer struck again. Annie Chapman was a 47-year-old widow who had fallen on hard times. Like Polly Nichols, she was turned away from a lodging house for lack of funds. At around 5:30 in the morning, her body was discovered in the backyard of number 29 Hanbury Street. The scene was horrific. Her throat was cut, and her body had been mutilated in a manner that suggested the killer possessed some anatomical knowledge. The precision of the cuts led the police surgeon to speculate that the perpetrator might be a doctor or a butcher. Panic began to spread through Whitechapel like wildfire as the realization hit that a serial murderer was loose. The murder of Annie Chapman escalated the situation significantly. The press began to sensationalize the crimes, publishing lurid details that terrified the public. Mobs began to form in the streets, attacking anyone who looked suspicious or out of place. The police were under immense pressure to catch the culprit, but they were hampered by the primitive investigative techniques of the time. Fingerprinting was not yet in use, and crime scene preservation was virtually non-existent. Curious onlookers would often trample through the evidence before the police could secure the area. In this chaotic environment, The killer continued to evade capture, slipping through the foggy streets like a phantom. Tensions between the public and the police reached a boiling point. The Metropolitan Police, led by Sir Charles Warren, were criticized for their inability to protect the citizens of the East End. Vigilante groups formed known as the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee to patrol the streets at night. They carried whistles and heavy sticks, hoping to catch the killer in the act. The atmosphere in London was one of paranoia and suspicion. Every man with a black bag was looked at with fear, and every shadow seemed to hide a monster. The killer seemed to feed on this fear, growing more bold with each passing day. It was during this period of heightened hysteria that the name Jack the Ripper was born. On September 27th, the Central News Agency received a letter written in red ink. The author boasted about the murders and mocked the police for their incompetence. The letter was signed "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." While many police officials believed the letter was a hoax created by a journalist to sell more papers, the name stuck. It gave a persona to the monster and transformed the unknown killer into a legendary figure of evil. The name was plastered across headlines worldwide, cementing the notoriety of the case. The terror intensified on the night of September 30th, a date that would become known as the double event. At 1 a.m, the body of Elizabeth Stride was found in Dutfield's yard off Burner Street. Her throat had been cut, but unlike the previous victims, she had not been mutilated. It is believed that the killer was interrupted by the arrival of a cart and was forced to flee before he could finish his gruesome work. Elizabeth Stride, sometimes called Long Liz, was a Swedish immigrant who had lived a hard life in London. Her death alone would have been tragic, but the night was far from over. Less than an hour after the discovery of Elizabeth Stride, the killer struck again. Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square, within the jurisdiction of the City of London Police. This time, the killer had not been interrupted. The mutilations were severe and extensive. The killer had also taken a trophy, cutting a piece of her apron and taking a kidney. The audacity of committing 2 murders in such close proximity and within such a short time frame demonstrated a terrifying level of confidence. The police were now dealing with 2 crime scenes and 2 jurisdictions, complicating the investigation further. As the police scoured the area around Mitre Square, they found a crucial piece of evidence. In a doorway on Galston Street, they discovered the blood-stained piece of apron taken from Catherine Eddowes. Above the apron, a message was chalked on the wall. It read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The meaning of this graffito has been debated for over a century. Some believe it was a clue left by the killer, while others think it was unrelated anti-Semitic graffiti common in the area. Fearing a riot against the Jewish population, Sir Charles Warren ordered the writing to be washed away before it could be photographed, a decision that destroyed potentially vital evidence. Following the double event, the police received another communication that chilled them to the bone. George Lusk, the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, received a small box in the mail. Inside was half of a human kidney preserved in wine. Accompanying the grisly artifact was a letter famously known as the From Hell letter. The writer claimed to have fried and eaten the other half of the kidney. While the authenticity of the kidney was never definitively proven, the letter differed in tone and handwriting from the earlier Dear Boss letter, suggesting it might have come from the true killer. October passed without incident, and the people of London began to hope that the horror had ended. The police remained vigilant, but the leads were drying up. Inspector Abberline and his team chased down hundreds of suspects, ranging from local butchers to wealthy aristocrats, but no charges could be made. The fog of November rolled in, bringing with it a renewed sense of dread. The killer had simply been waiting, biding his time for the grand finale. On the morning of November 9th, the silence was broken by the discovery of the most gruesome crime scene yet. Mary Jane Kelly was the youngest of the canonical 5 victims at just 25 years old. Unlike the other women, she was killed inside her own room at number 13 Miller's Court. This gave the killer the privacy and time he needed to carry out his work without fear of interruption. When the landlord's assistant looked through the broken window to collect the rent, he was met with a sight that would haunt him forever. The mutilation of Mary Jane Kelly was absolute. She was barely recognizable as a human being. The killer had spent hours dissecting her, leaving the room awash in blood. The murder of Mary Jane Kelly marked the crescendo of the Ripper's reign of terror. The brutality was so extreme that it seemed the killer had unleashed all his rage in one final act. The police were desperate. They photographed the scene extensively, a rare practice, at the time hoping to find some clue amidst the carnage. But once again, the killer had left no definitive evidence. No fingerprints, no witnesses, and no weapon. The investigation into the death of Mary Jane Kelly hit the same dead ends as the previous cases, leaving detectives frustrated and demoralized. After the death of Mary Jane Kelly, the murders attributed to Jack the Ripper seemed to stop as suddenly as they had begun. There were other murders in Whitechapel in the years that followed, but none bore the specific signature of the Ripper. The police investigation continued for years, but the file remained open. The sudden cessation of the crimes led to many theories. Had the killer died? Had he been imprisoned for another crime? Or had he simply emigrated to another country to continue his dark work elsewhere? The lack of closure only added to the mystery. Throughout the investigation, several key suspects emerged. One of the primary suspects was Montague John Druitt, a barrister and school teacher, who committed suicide in the River Thames shortly after the murder of Mary Jane Kelly. Some senior police officials believed Druitt was the killer, claiming he was sexually insane. However, there was little concrete evidence linking him to the crimes other than the timing of his death. His family believed he had taken his own life due to depression and a fear of hereditary mental illness rather than guilt over the murders. Another significant suspect was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-Jewish immigrant who lived in Whitechapel. Kosminski was known to be mentally ill and had a hatred of women. He was eventually committed to an asylum in 1891. Sir Robert Anderson, a high-ranking police official, later claimed that Kosminski had been positively identified by a witness who refused to testify. However, the reliability of this identification has been questioned by modern historians. Kosminski fits the profile of a disorganized killer living in the area, but definitive proof remains elusive. Michael Ostrog was a Russian criminal and con artist who was also listed as a suspect. He had a long history of theft and fraud and was known to carry knives. However, further research revealed that Ostrog was likely in prison in France during the time of the Ripper murders, making his involvement impossible. His inclusion in the suspect list highlights the desperation of the police to find anyone who fit the description of a violent criminal. The investigation was often clouded by prejudice against immigrants, leading the police to focus on foreign suspects. More sensational theories have pointed fingers at the highest levels of society. The royal conspiracy theory suggests that Prince Albert Victor, the grandson of Queen Victoria, was involved in the murders. This theory claims the killings were a cover-up to hide a secret marriage and an illegitimate child. While this makes for a compelling story, there is no historical evidence to support it. Records show that the prince was not even in London during several of the murders. Despite this, the idea of a royal ripper has persisted in fiction and film. Another famous name linked to the case is the painter Walter Sickert. Author Patricia Cornwell has argued that Sickert was the Ripper, basing her theory on interpretations of his paintings and DNA evidence found on letters. Sickert was fascinated by the murders and even painted a series titled The Camden Town Murder. However, most art historians and ripperologists dismiss this theory, citing a lack of physical evidence and the fact that Sickert had an alibi for at least one of the murders. The fascination with famous suspects often overshadows the more likely reality of a local unknown killer. George Chapman, also known as Severin Klosowski, was a poisoner who was hanged in 1903. Inspector Abberline himself suspected Chapman might have been the Ripper. Chapman lived in Whitechapel during the murders and was known to be violent toward women. However, serial killers rarely change their modus operandi so drastically from slashing to poisoning. While Chapman was certainly a murderer, it is unlikely he was the man who terrorized Whitechapel in 1888. The search for a suspect who fits all the criteria continues to frustrate researchers. The challenges facing the Victorian police cannot be overstated. Forensic science was in its infancy. There was no DNA profiling, no blood type analysis, and no national fingerprint database. Police relied heavily on eyewitness testimony, which in the foggy and dark streets of Whitechapel was notoriously unreliable. Descriptions of the killer varied wildly. Some saw a man in a rough working outfit, while others described a gentleman in a top hat and cape. This inconsistency made it nearly impossible to build a solid profile of the perpetrator. The layout of Whitechapel itself aided the killer. The district was a maze of rookeries and slaughterhouses. The killer likely knew the geography, intimately allowing him to navigate the back streets and evade patrols. He could strike and vanish within minutes, melting back into the population. The heavy smog known as a pea souper frequently blanketed the city, reducing visibility to a few feet. This natural cover provided the perfect shield for his crimes, allowing him to move unseen, even in a densely populated area. The media played a massive role in the Jack the Ripper phenomenon. The Star and other newspapers realized that sensational headlines sold copies. They published graphic details of the murders and printed hundreds of letters claiming to be from the killer. This media frenzy created a feedback loop of panic and misinformation. It pressured the police to make arrests, often leading to the harassment of innocent men. The Ripper case was one of the first examples of trial by media where the public court of opinion outweighed legal due process. The social impact of the murders was profound. For the first time, the eyes of the nation were forced to look at the appalling conditions in the East End. The murders highlighted the extreme poverty, overcrowding, and lack of sanitation that plagued the working class. Intellectuals and social reformers used the tragedy to argue for better housing and social welfare. George Bernard Shaw famously wrote a letter pointing out that the murders had done more to improve the conditions of the poor than years of social activism. In a twisted way, the Ripper forced society to confront its own failures. The legacy of Jack the Ripper extends far beyond the history books. He is considered by many to be the first modern serial killer. The investigation into his crimes laid the groundwork for criminal profiling. Doctors and police surgeons attempted to deduce the killer's psychology and occupation based on the nature of the wounds. This was a pioneering approach that would eventually evolve into the behavioral science units used by law enforcement today. The failures of the 1888 investigation taught valuable lessons about crime scene preservation and evidence collection. Today, the mystery of Jack the Ripper continues to captivate the world. Ripperology has become a field of study, with thousands of amateur detectives poring over the old case files. Every year, new books are published claiming to have finally solved the riddle. DNA tests on shawls and letters appear in the news regularly, though they are often inconclusive or contaminated. The desire to put a name to the face of evil is a powerful human drive. We want to believe that logic and science can solve any puzzle, no matter how old. Whitechapel has changed dramatically since 1888. The slums have been cleared, and the gas lamps replaced with electric lights. Hip cafes and art galleries now stand where the victims once walked. But if you walk down the cobblestones of the few remaining old streets on a foggy night, you can still feel the weight of history. The shadows still seem to hold secrets. The locations of the murders are now stops on guided tour, where tourists listen to the grisly details of the past. Ultimately, the identity of Jack, the Ripper, remains the greatest unsolved murder mystery in history. Was he a doctor, a butcher, a royal, or a common laborer? Was he a madman driven by voices, or a cold calculator seeking notoriety? The truth is likely lost to time, buried in the unmarked graves of the Victorian era. The killer succeeded in his quest for immortality not through his own name, but through the pseudonym that came to define fear itself. As we look back on the autumn of terror, we must remember the victims. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. They were real women with families and hopes who were robbed of their lives in the most brutal way imaginable. They should not be mere footnotes in the legend of a monster. Their stories remind us of the harsh realities of history and the endurance of the human spirit in the face of darkness. The case of Jack the Ripper is a dark mirror, reflecting the anxieties of the Victorian age and our own fascination with the macabre. It is a story of police failure, media manipulation, and social inequality. It serves as a grim reminder that evil can walk among us undetected. As long as the identity of the Whitechapel murderer remains unknown, the shadow of Jack the Ripper will continue to loom over the history of crime, challenging us to solve the puzzle that has baffled the world for over a century.